Mechadendrites unfold above a strapped-down form, saw attachments, injector lines, pincer claws, drilling heads extending in sequence like fingers opening. A tech priest's vox-filtered voice intones what is, in his theology, a benediction. The procedure concludes. What shuffles out of that chamber minutes later opens a corridor door, holds it, and waits. 100 citizens walk through over the course of an hour. Nobody slows down. Nobody looks. The thing holding the door is furniture to them, as unremarkable as the door itself. That isn't a dramatic flourish. That is the daily reality of the Warhammer 40,000 Imperium of Man, documented across Black Library fiction and codex entries spanning decades of lore. And the thing holding the door was a person. The Imperium of Man does not merely tolerate the conversion of human beings into living machines. It has industrialized the practice, theologized it, and distributed it so thoroughly across every layer of civilization that an entire species has forgotten to be horrified. The most damning evidence isn't the lobotomy, it's the indifference. And the most damning fact, the one that strips away every justification the Imperium has ever offered, is a production line that the lore mentions almost in passing, as though it were routine. Because to the Adeptus Mechanicus, it's. Start with what is uncontested. Criminals and heretics sentenced under Imperial law can be handed over to the Adeptus Mechanicus and subjected to Servitude Imperpituis, unending labor, preceded by what the Fandom Wiki and Bell of Lost Souls both describe as painful operations, mind-wiping, reprogramming, and cybernetic augmentation. The Adeptus Arbites sentences them. The tech priests convert them. What was a person becomes a unit of function, assigned a task, and deployed indefinitely. The Imperium frames this as mercy. The condemned are, as the lore puts it, granted one last chance to serve. A criminal becomes a servitor. The punishment is theological. The justification exists. Except the Imperium didn't stop there. Alongside the criminal pipeline, there is a second one. The Warhammer 40,000 Codex, sourced through an AnyFlip Codex scan cross-referenced against the Fandom Wiki's servitor page, confirms it in plain language. A number of servitors are built upon a base of vat-grown bodies of flesh and blood, typically human. Vat-grown, manufactured. Bodies grown in tanks specifically so they can be converted. These humanoids never committed a crime. They were never sentenced. They never had names or identities or any existence prior to the conversion process for which they were built. No Arbites involvement. No legal ceremony. No one last chance. They were constructed for this. The punishment justification doesn't apply to them. It can't. There is nothing to punish. What the Imperium is running, alongside its penal processing system, is a manufacturing operation. It grows human bodies in order to lobotomize them, and a tech priest calls that process holy. This is the prosecutorial center of what follows, not a catalog of Imperial horrors, not a countdown of worst jobs or worst fates assembled for runtime. One thesis, sustained and built with evidence. The Imperium of Man has constructed a civilization in which the industrial conversion of human beings into mindless machinery is so normalized, so theologically endorsed, so architecturally embedded in daily life, that billions of citizens walk past the results every single day without a flicker of recognition. One commenter, responding to a previous video on Imperial horrors, described the horror of staring into the eyes of human beings reduced to unthinking, unquestioning machines. That response drew nearly 300 responses from people who understood exactly what he meant. Another commenter, same video, same week, said Imperial citizens probably see a servitor not much different than a lawnmower. Nearly 30 people agreed with him. Both of them are right, and that is the horror. The Adeptus Mechanicus isn't, in their own understanding, doing something monstrous. This is critical to establish before anything else, because the instinct is to cast them as sadists, as cruelty dressed in robes and Mechadendrites. They aren't sadists. They are theologians. Their entire doctrinal framework, the cult Mechanicus, holds that flesh is merely a worthless construct with which to house sacred knowledge. Their words, documented by Bell of Lost Souls in their 2025 coverage of the cult Mechanicus, used only to house sacred knowledge. The body isn't the point. The mind that processes information, the spirit that animates the machine, those are the sacred things. Flesh decays. Flesh fails. Flesh is, per the 15th universal law of the cult Mechanicus, fallible. Ritual honors the machine spirit. That is doctrine. That is their scripture. From inside that framework, replacing organic components with reliable machinery isn't degradation, it's elevation. The conversion of a human being into a servitor is, in the theological language the Mechanicus applies to it, a blessed conversion. The removal of fallible flesh, the subordination of the unreliable organic to a higher purpose. The Fandom Wiki's Cult Mechanicus page describes it as the sacred work in this context. The Mechanicus calls it sanctification. They mean it. This isn't cynical cover for cruelty. Their sincere belief that lobotomy represents theological improvement is precisely what makes the normalization possible. You can't shame a man for doing what his entire civilization considers holy. And you can't shock a citizen into horror when their civilization has spent 1,000 years telling them the procedure is a sacrament. To see how thoroughly this theology has permeated imperial society, you need only look at where servitors appear. Not just in Mechanicus temples, everywhere. Every layer of imperial infrastructure runs on converted human labor. Doormen, data clerks, Vox relay stations, gun platforms aboard warships, ship components, manufacturing facilities, guard posts, administrative centers. An academic paper analyzing the 40,000 universe notes in passing that machine workers called servitors are seen conducting large-scale operations as a feature of imperial production. They aren't exceptional, they are infrastructure. And infrastructure, by definition, disappears. You stop seeing the electrical conduits in the wall. You stop noticing the weight-bearing columns. You stop registering the things that simply work, because they have always worked, and they require nothing from you except to use them. That is what centuries of normalization produces. Master of Mankind, a Black Library novel consistently cited in lore community discussions, contains an observation that cuts cleanly to the point. In community threads analyzing the text, the passage is summarized as, "Even the more morally aware characters treat servitors like pieces of furniture, never once stopping to think that it was once a living, breathing human. Even the good ones. The characters who would, in another context, recoil from cruelty. They walk past the servitor holding the door. They receive the data slate from the servitor at the desk. They move through rooms maintained by servitors bolted to workstations, and none of it registers as worth examining. This isn't a character flaw in those individuals. It's an infrastructure failure at civilizational scale. The citizen who doesn't flinch isn't a monster. They are a person who has never been given the information needed to flinch. They were born into a civilization where flesh is weak is doctrinal truth taught by the most powerful technological institution in the galaxy. They have grown up surrounded by servitors at every tier of daily existence. No imperial institution exists whose function is to question Mechanicus theological claims. The Church of the Emperor handles human souls. The Adeptus Mechanicus handles the body's relationship to machinery. And the overlap between those jurisdictions isn't a space any official body occupies. The citizen at the door doesn't look twice at the thing holding it open because their civilization spent 1,000 years ensuring they wouldn't. Someone in a comment thread captured the practical consequence of this with a single image. If a human brain were installed in a lamppost to run the light, and you walked past that lamppost every day for the entirety of your life, at what point would the lamppost just be a lamppost? That is the answer to why nobody flinches. The question underneath it, the one the Imperium never asks, is what the brain in the Lamppost experiences. The lore is almost entirely silent on this, intentionally by design. Standard conversion procedure is intended to produce, as lore community sources summarize it, a state of lobotomized oblivion. The mental erasure is the point. What gets removed is the person. What remains is the function. The Mechanicus isn't concerned with the question of whether something survives the procedure, because their theological framework has already answered it. Flesh is worthless, and what was housed in the flesh has been freed to serve a higher purpose. The question does not arise within their doctrine, so the doctrine produces no mechanism for checking. There are accounts, documented in Reddit lore communities, in scattered canonical references, suggesting some conversions produce incomplete results. Instances where personality fragments persist, where something of the original individual remains trapped behind the servitor's programmed behaviors, unable to communicate or act independently, but present. The lore community's consensus on the statistics is bleak. For the overwhelming majority, the oblivion is complete. The process works as designed. One account circulating in lore community discussions, its precise origin unconfirmed, the specific source unverified across the research batch, and best treated as a community paraphrase of possible lore rather than a confirmed citation, describes a first-person view from inside a failed conversion. The voice describes remembering who they are, remembering everything. Something went wrong during the transformation. They are still there. Whether it originates in a game, an audio drama, or a community retelling of lore themes, it demonstrates that the possibility exists, that the process can fail to erase, that a person can survive inside the machine. The Imperium does not verify whether this has happened. It has no procedure for checking. No institution whose mandate includes determining whether the individual scheduled for conversion has been successfully removed or whether they remain inside, watching through eyes they can't direct, holding doors for people who look straight through them. The Mechanicus has no theological incentive to find out. If flesh is worthless, the question of whether it's still suffering is irrelevant to their framework. That ambiguity, maintained not through conspiracy but through the complete absence of curiosity, is the actual weapon. The case against the Imperium isn't, they are definitely lobotomizing conscious people. The case is simpler and harder to dismiss. They never check. They have never checked. The theology that makes the conversion holy also makes the checking unnecessary, so the checking does not happen, and a civilization of 1,000,000 worlds goes about its business. If you want to understand the distance between servitor creation and acknowledged torture, the penitent engines of the Adeptus Arbites are useful as a point of comparison, not because they are worse, but because their horror operates differently. Convicted individuals are hardwired into bipedal combat walkers. Fiber optic neural connectors and chemical injectors are implanted directly into the pilot's brain and spine. This is confirmed in the fandom wiki's penitent engine entry. The pilot is kept alive, deliberately kept conscious. Stimulants and other drugs are administered to ensure the pilot survives injuries while still feeling the pain of everything. The machine's controls override any attempt to stop. Penitence is conducted through the body. The crucial distinction: penitent engine pilots are meant to be conscious. Their awareness of what is happening to them is the theological mechanism. It isn't a malfunction, it's the design. The horror is intentional and explicit, which perversely makes it more legible than the servitor. At least the ecclesiarchy acknowledges it's doing something to a person. A viewer in an earlier lore discussion described crying while thinking about the trapped consciousness inside a penitent engine. That response makes complete sense. The suffering is visible, named, and built into the machine's purpose. The servitor is harder to cry over. That's the problem. That's precisely the problem. The claim circulating in some lore discussions that the Adeptus Arbites sentences children to penitent engines. The research record can't verify this. It doesn't appear in the confirmed canonical sources reviewed here. The general horror of what a penitent engine does to any individual is sufficient for the argument. The children claim should be treated with skepticism until sourced properly. Return to the servitors. Return to the temples. Praetorian servitors are the Adeptus Mechanicus' designation for their armed conversion guards, massive constructs created from, according to the fandom wiki, the vat-grown bodies of genetically engineered giant humanoids or from mind-scrubbed ogrins. They are deployed specifically to protect tech priests and the temples dedicated to the machine god. This detail completes a loop that the Mechanicus themselves would likely find beautiful were they inclined toward irony. The converted stand guard over the temples where conversion is performed. The sanctified protect the site of the sanctification. The product of the theology defends the theology from external challenge, without knowing it, without being able to know it, without even retaining whatever they might have once felt about the arrangement. The victim guards the faith. The victim can't object to guarding the faith. The faith, accordingly, is never challenged from within. There is a line of argument that circulates in lore communities, sometimes stated seriously, sometimes used as a thought experiment, about where the worst existence in the Imperium actually falls. The guardsman facing down a tyrannid swarm is terrifying. The laborer on a death world with 12-hour sulfur storms is brutal. The naval conscript sealed into a ship compartment for a void engagement that takes years is bleak. But there is a credible case, and community voices have articulated it directly, that none of those fates represent the actual floor. One commenter put the position plainly. The concept of worst existence doesn't land on the guardsman facing a gene stealer cult. It lands on simply being a normal citizen. A normal citizen in a civilization where lobotomized humans line the corridors and nobody registers them as people. A civilization where the most powerful technological institution in the galaxy holds as its core doctrine that flesh is worthless and conversion is holy. A civilization with no counter-narrative, no institution whose function is to say otherwise, no record of anyone successfully arguing that the process should stop. The ordinary citizen walking past the door-holding servitor isn't outside the horror, they are inside it. They have been so thoroughly processed by it that they've lost the capacity to see it. And then there is the vat-grown pipeline. Return to it because it has to land correctly. The criminal sentenced to Servitude Imperpituis has a name in the record. The Arbites have a file. There was a trial, or, at minimum, a documented accusation. There is a paper trail connecting the servitor in the corridor to a person who once existed in Imperial society. That person can be mourned, at least in principle. Someone somewhere might remember them. The vat-grown servitor has none of that. There was no name, there was no crime, there was no citizen. There was a body manufactured in a tank, grown to the specification of the tech priest who ordered it, for the explicit purpose of the conversion that followed. The body was always going to become a servitor. That was its entire reason for existence. The Imperium didn't take a person and convert them. It built a conversion product that happened to be human-shaped. And a tech priest called the procedure holy and meant it and moved to the next one. No file, no record, no mourning, no before. Just a function, operating in a corridor on a world in an Imperium of 1,000,000 worlds. Indistinguishable from every other servitor, holding every door that every citizen walks through without looking. The worst fate in the Imperium isn't dying in a trench. It isn't drowning on a death world or burning in a void breach. It's existing in a civilization so comprehensively broken by its own theology that it has forgotten to ask whether the thing holding the door is suffering, and manufactured an entire class of beings for whom the question of suffering never had to be answered, because there was never anyone to ask it on their behalf. The Imperium didn't corrupt them, it built them, and the citizen walks through the door, and the lamppost lights the street, and nobody flinches. If this kind of deep dive argument is what you're here for, subscribe, there's more coming.